Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Good? Wonderful. I hope you're enjoying our day at sea today. Welcome to Illuminations. As we continue our Cunard Insights lecture program, I'm so delighted to bring our next lecturer up to the stage, who is no stranger to us here at Cunard. And we're always happy to have him back each and every year, especially on the World Voyage. And today he's going to present his first of 6 talks for you, entitled Supersonic Flight. Please give a warm welcome to Captain Christopher Rigby.
Thank you, Alex, and welcome everybody. Thanks very much for coming. It's always nice to have a good audience on the first day. When they put you on at 10 o'clock, you're thinking, gosh, they haven't finished breakfast yet. They're never going to make it here. Anyway, we're humming a bit there, aren't we? My name is Chris Rigby. I've been a commercial pilot ever since I left school back in 1970. I was fortunate enough to be trained by BOAC BEA at their college at Hamble, just down the road from Southampton, where most of us embarked the other day. And joined BOAC, but unfortunately hit a large block of pilots, and there were union issues and what have you. So we were going to be left sitting on the ground for 2 years, and being a keen young lad, I didn't want to do that. So I moved off, and I went to a BEA subsidiary, Cyprus Airways, flew out of Cyprus for 2 years on Tridents, as you remember those, and then decided that was a bit of dead man's shoes. I left there, went to Britannia Airways at Birmingham Airport on the 737-200. I've got a bit of a hum here, Emil. Is it where I'm standing? There we are. Anyway, I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, and I got my command at the age of 27, which was very young for those days. Only the chief pilot's son and the chief training captain's son had beat me, and I thought, that doesn't count. So I did that for quite a few years, but I got rather bored of going up to Tenerife in the middle of the night, and I went freelance then, flew executive jets. I flew Chris de Burgh, Nigel Mansell, and other celebrities, government ministers around Europe in private jets for a while. And then a guy rang me up and he said, "Oh, we've got a new company starting up, Chris, are you interested? Next week in Luton." I said, "Who is it?" He said, "Outfit called EasyJet, have you heard of them?" I said, "Yeah, funny enough." And so I was in the first wave into EasyJet and did 4 years with them. But then rejoined British Airways at Birmingham Airport on the Embraer 145. And unfortunately, that was scheduled for a shutdown. That was eventually sold off to Flybe. So just at the right time, dear old Britannia relaunched themselves as Thompsons at Coventry, and I joined them as fleet manager on the 737 at Coventry. But unfortunately, after 4 years, they decided to shut Coventry down, and I have to get my cross in place. I joined Ryanair, who, believe it or not, are an incredibly professional outfit, and if anyone wants to talk about that. I've got 6 lectures, as Alex mentioned. They're very varied, and today we're going to deal with supersonic, but we're going to look at also how aircraft fly, what pilots do of their daily life, and we're also going to take a look at the budget airlines on one lecture. So if you're interested, please do come along. Now, today's lecture is quite a longish one. I've got various versions of it, but because there's nobody in the theatre behind me, I've taken the decision, I hope you don't mind, to do the long version, because there's an awful lot of stuff in here which is so interesting if you're interested in it. But if you're not interested in it and you find it a bit boring towards the end, please, I shan't be embarrassed or upset if you decide to go for lunch early. Not a problem at all. Anyway, so let's kick off. Supersonic flight, the dream, as it were. And here we can see an F-16 with what's called a transonic regime, where the shock wave is forming on its wing, and the low pressure behind the shock wave is causing that condensation of moisture, which we can see. So what do we mean by supersonic? Well, supersonic speed, as far as air is concerned, is the rate of travel of an object that exceeds the speed of sound, Mach 1, and incidentally, the word Mach comes from an Austrian scientist, Ernest Mach, who in the 19th century discovered shock waves in front of artillery shells. I beg your pardon, the 20th century, the 19th century, that's right, discovered this and actually photographed them. And so Mach 1 is rated as the speed of sound. Now, at sea level, a normal ambient day, around about 20 degrees centigrade, the speed of sound is approximately 768 miles per hour. But the speed of sound is affected by temperature significantly. Not pressure, but by temperature. Pressure does have a very minor effect, but nothing of any significance, but it is temperature. So at altitude where the supersonic aircraft fly, if I can get the next slide on. I beg your pardon. There we are. At high cruising altitude, the temperature is typically minus 60 degrees centigrade. And the speed of sound reduces with that reduction of temperature to about 655 miles an hour, around about 100 miles an hour less at the cruising altitude, which is quite remarkable, really. And approaching the speed of sound, as we saw that aircraft in that opening shot, some parts of the aircraft, such as the canopies, the wing structures, where the air has to accelerate over them and go past the super speed of sound on those areas, this is called the transonic regime. And this is the big, big problem with getting into supersonic flight, as we're going to see. So, what about other materials? I find this very interesting. We think of the speed of sound in air, which is what we deal with, because I'm speaking to you here. You can hear the sound waves hitting your eardrums, which is interpreting it as speech into the brain. But what about other materials? Does sound travel through other materials? Well, it must do if you think about it, because you can hear somebody shouting in a room. So you're outside the room, but you can hear the sound transmitted through those materials. But what about the speed of sound through these different materials? Now, what about water? We've all been swimming, and we've heard the motorboat in the distance going. You think, dare I come up, or should I stay down for a bit longer, and how long is that going to be? What about water? Who thinks the speed of sound is slower in water? Hands up. Who thinks it's faster? Who doesn't want to commit themselves? Well, actually, it's 5 times faster in water. Now, what about concrete? Very dense material. Does that slow speed down, or does it fasten? Who thinks it's slower in concrete? Who thinks it's faster? Well, it's 9 times faster through concrete than air. What about a piece of pine, a piece of soft wood along the grain? Who thinks it's slower? Who thinks it's faster? Well, it is 10 times as fast as air. Is there anybody else thinks that it's slower in steel? In fact, it's 18 times as fast through a bar of steel as it is through air. And that's because the molecules are so tightly bound to each other, and they bang into each other, so they transmit the sound wave through itself. So it's quite interesting when we watch those cowboy films with the Indians or the cowboys with their ear on the rail, listening for the train coming in the distance. They're listening for a signal which is traveling down the rail 9 times faster than Concorde flew. Interesting, isn't it? They had time to make a cup of tea before the train arrived, for sure. Okay, I just thought that's a little bit of an interesting side about sound and how it works. During the war, of course, UK, USA, and Germany, of course, were all interested in going faster and faster for obvious military advantageous regions, and they all had their research departments looking into that. And in 1943, the Minister of Air Production in the UK issued a spec for an aircraft to be built that could do 1,000 miles an hour. Now, 43, mid-war, okay? We were a Spitfire regime, 400 miles an hour, 500 maybe. Looking for 1,000 miles an hour. This was a very big ask and could go up to 36,000 feet. And the contract for development went very surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, to a very small company run by 2 brothers, the Miles brothers. And maybe it was just said, well, it's not doable, so hey, you have a look at it. You know, you other guys who are building the big aircraft, don't you waste your time on this. And many did think it was a totally impossible task. But this is the design they came up with. This is the M52, the Miles Brothers M52. And what's interesting about this design, several items. Firstly, this is where the pilot sat, of course, and around the outside of the pilot, completely circular, was the air intake for the engine, which was housed down here. But for the first time, what's known as swept wing technology started to be brought in to aircraft. If you think of the Spitfire, the leading edge was almost 90 degrees to the body. The thought of sweeping wings back hadn't really been brought in. The Germans were looking at it, and a lot of technology came from them post-war, but also the wingtips were swept wing. But the big, big design advance that the British made was this tailplane, the elevator. Normally an elevator is flaps at the back of the wing which wind up and down and therefore increase and decrease the lift on the tailplane. But the British realised that you had to make the whole tailplane move around a hinge joint for this to work. And this was the key of the British design. Very significant. This was a mock-up model, wind tunnel model they made for it. There were 2 made. This is the only surviving one. And for this aircraft, you'd obviously need a very powerful engine. And this is Frank Whittle. This is the W2 engine aircraft which he designed for it. And for this engine, he invented reheat, which we know about the military jets and Concorde and other supersonic transport. So he was the inventor of reheat on this particular engine. So by early 1946, just post-war, the Miles had a full-scale mock-up, which they had been playing around with. They'd got all the materials in their hangars, workshops, ready to make 3 prototypes. They were ready to go. The first test flights were planned for the summer. It was all a very exciting time. But then in February 46, Sir Ben Lockspear, the Director General of the Ministry of Air Production, cancelled the project. He just wrote a note saying, change of mind, project cancelled. The mock-up, the tools and jigs were all destroyed. All the plans, blueprints were handed to the USA. Sorry, Americans with us today. And the Americans did acknowledge afterwards that moving elevator was significant in their development eventually of the... Sorry? We're just going to go into that in a second. Okay. So here's the artist's impression of the M52 with a Meteor in flight, and there is the American X-1. Do you notice any similarities at all between the two? And they had the all-moving tailplane, which they didn't have before the plans were sent across. So why? Why did it happen? Well, the gentleman was wondering if it was lack of money. It could have been a factor for sure. It's thought, though, the main influence for cancelling the project came, believe it or not, from Barnes Wallis, the inventor of the bouncing bomb. He had become very friendly with all the squadrons doing the Dam Busters raid, and 53 RAF airmen had lost their lives that night, and he was personally mortified with this loss, even though the raid was a success as such. And he didn't believe supersonic speed was possible. He believed, if it possibly was, it would cost so many lives getting there, it wasn't worth doing. And it is fairly well accepted that he advised strongly not to proceed with the program. He also believed the engine probably wasn't quite powerful enough, nor was the structure of the aircraft possibly strong enough to stand the strain. And he may well have been right, we will never know that. But for whatever reason, it was cancelled. So, who was the first man to break the speed of sound? Was it? It was very probably this man, a chap called George Welch. George was very decorated US airman, retired, joined North American, and was actually the project test pilot for the Sabre aircraft, which they were developing. At the same time, the X-1 rocket jet was being developed. Both were government-funded projects, and the US Air Ministry, Secretary of State, decided and declared that under no circumstances whatsoever were North American to break the sound barrier before the X-1. So Mr. Walsh took his aircraft up to high altitude, dived it. 2 sonic booms were heard, but there was no instrumentation on it to prove that what he'd done. But it is generally accepted he was actually the first man to survive, should we say, a supersonic flight. So a little bit of interesting history here. So who was the man officially? You're quite right, Chuck Yeager. And there he was in Glennis. He'd actually had a horse riding accident a couple of days before and had 2 broken ribs. And he didn't declare that because he knew he'd be taken off the project should that happen. So he kept quiet and off he went. And the X-1 was dropped in October the 14th, 1947.
At extremely high altitude.
Here's the actual footage of it happening.
There she goes. A big moment in a history-making flight. Now she's approaching the barrier. The speed of sound at 35,000 feet is 660 miles per hour. The really big moment. Through the sound barrier. The first time ever in level flight.
So that was, ladies and gentlemen, the first time the sound barrier had been officially broken by Chuck Yeager. Who was the first Briton to break the sound barrier? Gentleman in the audience does know, because we were speaking about it just a bit earlier on. Anybody else know? It was possibly Geoffrey de Havilland. He similarly took an aircraft, the Swallow aircraft in 1946, and dived it over Canvey Island. The aircraft broke up. The instruments that were on board were destroyed, so again, there was no proof. But again, it was said that a sonic boom was heard, so it is possible that he was the first Briton, but he died in that crash. So you can perhaps see why Barnes-Wallis thought there was a bit of an issue going on here. Maybe he had a point. And the first person to officially break the sound barrier, in fact, was John Derry in 48 in the DH-108, and then subsequently in the DH-110. And here's the DH-110
John Derry
in flight.
regularly on successive days put this twin-engine multi-purpose fighter into a supersonic dive.
Starting to accelerate now. Coming up to the speed of sound now. Passing it now.
On one occasion, the Minister of Defence, Lord Alexander, was there to see him do it.
So that was John Derry in the DH-110, the first British aircraft going supersonic. But then, unfortunately, in 1952, the actual normal aircraft they used for test flying and for demonstrations was faulty, and they had to go and get the spare aircraft. And they came in, they did a supersonic run, and I've just been told by William, who's just approached me outside, that the reason it actually broke up was after overflying the airfield, they were supposed to do a tight turn, come back in and over the crowd again. And Derry misjudged the turn. And then he realized that he had to tighten this turn up to come back in over Farnborough, so he tightened it up. And the extra G-force that put on the aircraft actually broke it up. So it wasn't the supersonic that broke it up, which most people think it was. Certainly I was under that impression. But apparently it was the actual high G-force turn that they did to try to come back in. But in true British fashion, the show went on. 28 people were killed, but within a few minutes, Neville Duke was flying his aircraft supersonically over Farnborough. You know, hey, it's wartime, it's gone, you know, there we are. The gladiatorial instinct carries on. These days, of course, it would stop instantaneously, but in those days, the show just went on. Now, for the ladies present, here we are. We talk about chaps doing it. Who was the first woman to break the sound barrier in a production aircraft? Anybody know her name? There we go. There she is, Jackie Cochran. American lady, married into a lot of money, was a dedicated flyer. There she is with Chuck Yeager. And she was in this place in a Canadian Air Force Super Sabre. She broke the sound barrier in 1953. So she was the first woman. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on Jackie Cochran because, again, the ladies often do not get acknowledged in aviation, but they have played a massive part over the years. Jackie Cochran, 1920, 1980, only 60 years of age when she died. Here she was at the age of 18, in 1938. And she was the first woman to win the Bendix race, which is a cross-country race in the United States. She was the first woman to land and take off from an aircraft carrier, you know, which is no mean feat in those days, the sort of aircraft they had. She was the first woman to reach Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. She was the first woman to pilot a bomber across the North Atlantic in 1941. And she was the first pilot, not woman, the first pilot to make a fully blind instrument landing. The first woman to fly a fixed-wing jet aircraft across the Atlantic. The first pilot to fly above 20,000 feet with an oxygen mask on. And she formed WASPs, the Women Auxiliary Service Pilots, who were the ladies who flew the bombers across the Atlantic in the war for the Allied forces to fly them over here. They were short of pilots. They couldn't afford men to do it, so they trained women. She was a great friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, who sponsored this, and this is a bunch of her girls trained to be pilots to fly the bombers across the world, the Atlantic. And then she went on to set a world speed record of 1,400 miles an hour, and in 64, and no fewer than 8 speed records in 67 when she was over 60 years of age, just before she died. She still holds today more speed and distance records than any other pilot, not woman, any other pilot, man, woman, alive or dead. And I bet you haven't heard of her. What do you have to do to be immortal in this world, I wonder, you know? So I like doing that because she was a tower of strength in the aviation industry, and again, we have hardly ever heard of her. Anyway, going back to the supersonic, what were the issues surrounding supersonic flight? What are the big problems? Well, one of the biggest ones is drag. Now, subsonically, we have what we call profile drag. This affects anything that passes through air, from an airplane to a car, etc. And that drag increases with the speed squared. So what do we mean by that? An aircraft flying at 200 miles an hour will have 40,000 units of drag. In other words, 200 times 200, okay? But if it doubles its speed to 400 miles an hour, the drag will increase to 160,000 units of drag. So in other words, for doubling of the speed, the drag quadruples. And this is true of your car driving down the motorway. So if you do that extra 10, 15 miles an hour down the motorway, the amount of fuel you're going to burn to overcome that profile drag is enormous. So this is why slow is best for fuel consumptions. So it's quite a remarkable thing. But approaching the speed of sound, Mach 1, there's another type of drag that comes in, and this is called wave drag. And this can increase 4 times faster than the profile drag. Now here's a little graph just to try to demonstrate this. This is Mach number along the bottom, the speed of sound. Here's the speed of sound at 1. And this, we'll just call drag units. It's actually the coefficient of drag, but it doesn't really matter. So we can just see there's a scale there. Now here we've got subsonic aircraft flying at around about 0.8. So 737, 747, all fly just here. And you can see why. Because here's the profile drag increasing with the speed squared. But once you get above that little bit there, past that 0.8 mark, whoosh, you see how it goes up? And to overcome that, of course, you've got to burn a most enormous amount of fuel. And you can see at the top there, it suddenly, having got through the sound barrier, suddenly it starts to decrease until it starts to flatten off there at around about 2.02, and that's exactly where Concorde was designed to fly, just on that lip there. And you can see the logic of that, what the rationale was with the drag. Other technical issues were surface skin heating. I'm sure we're all aware of the problems or the issues surrounding Concorde with that. And this is both the sun and friction affecting it. Concorde was painted white, so it would reflect the heat. We're going to look at the Blackbird, or Bluebird as it really was, a little later on. That was painted dark blue to emit heat more efficiently because its surface temperature was so high. But the surface and the friction and the sun acting together will take the temperature at 2.02 of Concorde to about 127 degrees, which is the melting softening point of aluminium. And interestingly enough, the aluminium which Concorde was built with was an alloy developed by Rolls-Royce back in 1928, would you believe, in conjunction with a small company in Slough, Metallurgical Industries of Slough. And they developed this alloy called RR58, and that alloy was used to make the pistons in the Supermarine Spitfire engine, and it's still used today by Ford Cosworth for their Formula One racing engines. There is no better alloy developed since 1928 by Rolls-Royce to do this sort of job, and Concorde was built with R58, which is rather a nice little British story, shall we say. And the heating causes the expansion of an aircraft of Concorde between 8 and 12 inches. So this aircraft, as you probably know, was expanding and contracting, and the technical issues surrounding that, making sure all the wires would stretch, all the hydraulic lines would stretch, all the fuel lines would stretch and come back. You think about that, not an easy job by any means. Never mind the tensions and things that brought on the aircraft. So the wings and the fuselage have to be much stronger and therefore heavier due to strength of the materials that are needed to stand the shockwave. And in fact, Concorde weight per passenger is 4 times, in terms of material, 4 times that of, say, something like a 747 today. So the actual shell was much heavier, simply because of the stresses that the aircraft went through. And then there's this massive turbulence caused by the shockwave and loss of control that appears to happen as you go through. And this was the factors that caused the breakup of the aircraft for Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. and many other people attempting to fly through the sound barrier. So the wings have to be very, very strong to overcome this turbulence effect. So what is a shockwave? Let's have a look at a diagram here. Here's a wing shape passing through the air. Now this is flying at Mach 0.82, so 0.82 the speed of sound. And we can see the airflow splitting and going either side of the wing. And because of this curvature of the wing, the air at the top has to accelerate to get over the top. This is what generates lift for an aircraft. But by doing so, of course, it means the air on the top of the wing will start to hit Mach 1 before the actual speed of the wing itself. So this is the transonic regime where the shock wave starts to form. Now the airflow in front of it is reasonably smooth, but behind it, it's turbulent, as you can see. And therefore the lift that that part of the wing would be generating is affected. and also the control surface at the back, which will affect the pitch of the wing, those are affected as well. So we need to get through this regime as fast as possible. We need to punch the aircraft through. And at 0.95, still below the speed of sound, the shock wave is pretty well down by the tail, but we can see this turbulent region still here, and really we need to get through that up to Mach 1.05, and we start to leave the shock wave behind. And that's the critical bit, getting through that shock wave. And that's where Concorde used reheat to blast through that regime, but did so very, very smoothly. So here again we can see a shock wave starting to form on two fighter jets. Here again is I think it's an F-15, and the shock wave is actually invisible, you can't see it. What you're seeing there once again is the low pressure behind the wing, which is condensing the air, cooling the air, and therefore condensing the moisture that's in that air. Therefore you can see it as a piece of cloud, as it were, a circular piece of cloud. Here's another shot of a B-1 bomber, an American bomber going supersonic across the lake, and the shock wave is just behind it, and you can see the low pressure behind ripping up the water behind it. I think that's an extraordinary photograph, that. And this is even more extraordinary. Just watch this. That apparently was the last day in the Air Force for that pilot. It's not clear whether it was the day he was leaving or it was for other reasons. Tea and biscuits with the squadron leader, I should think, after that. But very, very interesting. And then, of course, there's a sonic boom, which we're all more familiar with, as it were, the big boom that we hear. This is what it sounds like. This is Concorde. It was loud. I remember hearing it before quite a few times. And it did cause lots of problems for overflying territories around the world and led to the uncommercial ability of the aircraft in the end. So, what is a shockwave? Before I go onto the light and just describe what a shockwave is. When we go back to our speed of sound through different materials, and our steel bar, should we take, we hit one end of it with a hammer. You can perhaps appreciate all these molecules nicely, tightly bound to each other, and they also bump, 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 and they transmit the piece of the sound to the other end of the bar. And that's true of all materials. If that bar was, say, made of rubber, and we hit one end of it, we could almost imagine like a sort of brrrr going along the bar, the rubber compressing as it goes. And air does the same thing. Because air is a gas, you can compress it. Therefore, the way that sound is transmitted, what you're hearing from me now, is traveling at that 730 odd miles an hour towards you, and that's because each molecule is bumping into the next one in front of it. But it can only do that at a fixed rate. It's simply a molecular thing. One bumps into the other like that. So it will not go any faster than that for that temperature of air, which we saw before. So here's our airplane flying along, and the sound, the shock wave, if you like, from the sound is ahead of it. And it's around about 200 to 300 yards in front of the aircraft at normal speeds. Fine, but now the aircraft accelerates. But because this sound wave can't go any faster, because it is totally dependent on how the molecules bang into each other, this aircraft now catches up with its own sound wave. And that is the shock wave that we saw in that picture. And when that's the aircraft going through that sound barrier, so the aircraft will actually pass you before you even hear it, because the sound wave is falling behind. And you hear a double boom because what you first experience is the front edge of the shock wave striking your ear, the compression that hits you, and then once it's past you, you've got that vacuum behind it, that low pressure behind it, the air rushes in, a bit like a thunderbolt that you would hear, and the air goes clap as it fills the hole, so you hear this boom. So that's why you have a double bang on a shock wave. Shockwaves can also bend light. Now this was what Ernst Mach saw, and this is very interesting. There's a demonstration. There's an Atlas rocket being launched from Cape Kennedy back in February 2010. Now you're going to have to watch quite carefully here.
Supersonic flight. But on rare occasions, we do get a glimpse of something special. At Kennedy Space Center on February 11, 2010, an Atlas rocket launched into ideal conditions for showing off shockwave. And this is the result.
See that? So that ripple effect going up the screen. And that's the shock wave, the sound shock wave actually affecting the light as well. So there are multiple shock waves. Now, my wife and I actually saw an Atlas rocket being launched from Kennedy last November on its way to Mars. It was going to get there in September, so I was filming it hoping I was going to see all these shock waves, but no, didn't do it at all. And in fact, the commentary people got it totally wrong. They said T-minus 10, and we could see the darn rocket already up. And they said, oh, it's already up. Okay, fine. So there we are. Anyway, how do we get that fast? How do we actually bash it through that shockwave? We need a huge engine, of course. We need a massive engine. And the air at the back of the engine, if you think about it, has to be traveling faster than the actual aircraft. So if you want to fly this aircraft at Mach 2, Mach 3, whatever, the air coming out the back to push it along has to be going a lot quicker than that. But there's a problem with this. The speed of the air entering the front of the engine has to be subsonic, around about 400 miles an hour. So here's this aircraft going along Mach 2, Mach 3, whatever, but the air coming into the engine has to be slowed down to 400 miles an hour before it enters in the engine, before it can be fed fuel and chucked out the back at this high speed. That is a phenomenal task. How on earth do you slow air down in supersonic speed to 400 miles an hour in literally a few feet? That's all you've got to play with. How do you actually do it? And how do you then speed it up again? Well, here's the Olympus engine, which fed Concorde. When it was first developed, it was producing around about 10,000, 11,000 pounds of thrust. Finally, with Concorde, it was producing 36,000 pounds of thrust, and there was a design underway to take that up to 40, which is a huge amount of power. But to slow the airflow down in the nacelle, they had a series of doors at the front. First of all, you had this just jammer door, if you like, stopping the size of the hole. Once the air entered this, you had these deflector doors which took some of the air out there, and even in this channel here, here's the front of the engine here, they had these spill doors down below. And this mechanism which was designed was the real true secret of Concorde's success. It was a major, major problem. Certainly Concorde's had problems that way later on. Lots of supersonic aircraft had issues this way, and they were quite lucky in as much that digital technology arrived in the computerized industry, which they were able to use to control these doors. And if there was a piece of magic to Concorde's whole technical thing, as should we say, fashionable or unimaginable it is, this was it. These doors and slowing down the air into the engines was the little magical sparkle that Concorde had. So, the commercial race, who wanted to fly supersonic? Well, of course, we weren't alone in this. In the 50s, Britain was looking at building it with supersonic, with around about 100 passengers, flying around about just under twice the speed of sound. The French were also looking at a program, smaller aircraft, 70 seats, with a shorter range of around about 2,000 miles, which wouldn't have allowed it to go transatlantic. They were thinking more continental, up and down to Africa and places like that. And of course, the Americans didn't want to be left behind. In '61, Kennedy offered a grant of up to 75% of development funding to any American company that was selected subsequently to produce the American version SST. And of course, being Americans, best respect to the people present, it had to carry 250 people over a range of 4,000 nautical miles and flying up towards Mach 3. And that was really seriously pushing the bounds of technology that was available in the day. But it was estimated by 1990 there would be a market for anything up to 500 of these aircraft. So commercially it was quite an interesting proposition. So who could possibly build this? Well, this is the Valkyrie bomber built by North American, who had the expertise of doing it. A beautiful airplane it was. It was designed initially as a bomber, long-range nuclear bomber, because at that time missiles didn't go that fast, and it was designed to outrun anything. But before it was actually put into production, missiles had caught up, quite literally, and it was virtually obsolete before it got anywhere near production. Made of stainless steel, had these lovely little droop wings here on the side, which reduced drag at high speed, had these front canards, as they're known, to help control of the aircraft, and was powered by 6 massive engines, very heavy aircraft relative to its size. And here's a bit of footage of it actually flying.
You wanted to make a 90-degree left turn.
2 aircraft were subsequently built.
Your cockpit was well
test
beyond
purposes.
the turn point. Because
One actually had mid-air collision with some tail
and you
escorting
made the
fighter
turn,
aircraft
and
was destroyed,
hope you
and unfortunately all
judged
the crew
correctly.
died.
But after a little
The other one, I believe, is in the
experience, you got so
Smithsonian
you could do it very nicely.
Institute in the States. It looks like a huge dragonfly, doesn't it?
Good, but busy flight. Every flight was, every moment was packed.
This is what
And
the test pilot was talking about.
we used the B-58 to chase it many times up to Mach 2, but once it got above Mach 2, or twice the speed of sound, then of course the B-58 was left well behind. But
Working hard in there, isn't
we
it?
used the control room the whole time that they talked, you know, they followed us, talked us through a lot of the maneuvers, but the actual handling qualities were generally pretty good.
See those 6 engines in the back there. So probably a very expensive aircraft to operate fuel-wise as well. And this was their mock-up, or their artist design of the commercial version of that aircraft, of the Valkyrie, the NA-660. But they pulled out the race fairly early on. They realized their design just wasn't going to make it in terms of the specifications required. So Lockheed with them became interested, and of course you'll all recognize this, I'm sure, as Blackbird. But as I said before, actually it was blue. It was actually a dark blue, which was a special heat-emitting paint which they had to develop because the surface temperature of this aircraft went up to about 360 degrees centigrade, something like 3 times Concorde's surface temperature, because of that extra bit of frictional heating. So it was more important for them to emit heat, therefore the black or dark blue paint, to do that. It also was, I don't know if you can see in this photograph, this area in particular, these wings were actually corrugated to cope with the expansion and stretching of the temperatures on the aircraft. And this was largely made of titanium. Now, America at the time, and still, doesn't have large titanium deposits. This is in the middle of the Cold War. The only place that had large deposits of titanium just happened to be Russia, which was a bit of an issue. So they set up a myriad of companies around the world, research and development, metallurgical companies, Australia, you name it. And each of these companies were doing design work using titanium. So they would apply for export licenses for titanium from Russia, and it was all shipped to the world, and then it was shipped back to America. So all these bombers in the middle of the Cold War were all built with Russian titanium, which I think is a great story. Incidentally, they slowed their airflow down to the engines by these cones, which were on big screw jacks. They used to go forward and backward to increase or decrease the size of the aperture there for the engine intake, which was a very, very neat and clever design. Here's the Blackbird in flight. Very elegant airplane. I think they built about 70 of them. Around about 15 or so were lost in training flights. None was actually shot down in combat, but it was eventually scrapped. Although I have a friend who tells me it's not, and he's in the aviation industry big time, so apparently there's supposed to be a secret squadron of those still flying around America. There we are. So this was their version. This was Lockheed's attempt at a supersonic transport. Here's Concorde above it, so you can see the relative size of the two aircraft, but very similar and very elegant as well. And again, this was their artist impressions of what it would look like with Pan Am de Virion, who were still operating at the time. And then they presented their mock-up to the Federal Aviation Administration in '66, and what a beautiful, beautiful airplane that was. I mean, absolutely gorgeous looking aircraft. But there were question marks about its noise. There were question marks about problems with tires and the high speed for takeoff. But, you know, they threw their hat in the ring, and they certainly had the background technology. But then Boeing, of course, decided to come in on the act, and they made their play. And this was their design. They came up with a swept wing aircraft, like the F-111 bomber, which some of you may remember. So at low speed flight, the wings would come out in this format, so it would provide extra lift at slow speed, and at high speed, the wings would sweep back like that to form more of the traditional delta shape. And again, this is artist's impression of the Boeing model in flight, and one version of the wings being swept back. And they too also produced a mock-up, but in '66, President Nixon announced Boeing as the winner, much to everybody's surprise. But then there were 2 years of delay, design problems. They finally worked out that the weight of this swing wing mechanism was so high, it made the aircraft totally uncommercial in terms of weight and fuel burn. So they had to scrap it, and they went back to the Delta design, very similar to what Lockheed produced. And Lockheed, you can imagine, were a little bit upset about this, having their design effectively not copied, but certainly worked upon. And this, again, was Boeing's mock-up for the FAA. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you can see here, there's a little dome on the front, a bit like the 747 dome, and this fools the airflow into thinking it's not traveling quite as quick as it is. Interestingly enough, it's not being used in other aircraft, but Boeing obviously thought it was a good idea at the time. So Boeing got the go-ahead, but then there were huge environmental issues in the United States, or a lot of opposition to it. We tend to think that Concorde was rather picked upon because the Americans hadn't got one of their own. Maybe that's true to some extent, but there was massive opposition to the supersonic flights in the US. And in fact, they did a test run using the Valkyrie bomber, which we saw before, over the United States, not telling anybody. They just wanted to see what the effect was on the ground. And there was a corridor, something like 20 miles wide, where people complained about the boom, broken windows, etc., etc. And they had to pay out about $12,000 of compensation on that flight. So there was massive opposition to supersonic flights in the US. So March 71, despite all the support of President Nixon and his administration, the US Senate rejected further funding, and the House of Representatives followed suit in May 71. So largely that was the end of the American bid to go supersonic with commercial transport. But at the time, there were 115 unfilled orders by 25 airlines, and Concorde at the same time had 74 orders. So they were ahead in the commercial selling game of Concorde at the time. So that was that. So then there was just us, the Brits and the French, that is. Well, actually, not quite. The dear old Russians had their play. Concordski, the Tu-144. Everybody said it was a copy of Concorde. Certainly there were similarities in the shape and design, but actually there were significant design differences between the two aircraft. To start with, it had the Cunard on the front, which Concorde didn't have. And although it doesn't look a lot of difference, this leading edge of the wing was significantly aerodynamically different and led to Concorde's success aerodynamically, whereas Concordski was not so good. And inside, it was a bit Spartan, as you can see, very sort of orthodox seats, probably, I don't know, yucky coloured plastic, etc. And it was designed to carry between 120 and 140 people. But actually, it only usually carried about 80 because of weight restrictions on the aircraft. It flew just slightly faster than Concorde, 2.35, and about the same altitude. And here's a picture of the flight deck. And the Russians always painted this background to the instrumentation panel in this horrible green. I actually sat on a Russian aircraft once and was nearly ill just looking at it. So that was supposed to be restful, apparently. That was supposed to make you feel good. But perhaps it's just the different food the Russians and us eat. I don't know. But anyway, it didn't appeal to me very much. But the project started 2 years later than Concorde, but it was rushed through, and they called for 5 aircraft to be flying, and prototypes were built within 4 years. The first aircraft supposedly ready in '66. First flew ahead of Concorde in December '68 near Moscow, and it went through the speed barrier again ahead of Concorde in June '69. And then again ahead of Concorde became the first aircraft, commercial aircraft to exceed Mach 2. Until Paris came along. Bang. And obviously killed the crew and a few people on the ground as well. I actually saw the aircraft. That was at Le Bourget. I saw that aircraft 2 days before that happened. I'd flown in there when I was with Cyprus Airways, so that's quite a poignant thing for me. But they obviously carried on flying, and they introduced it 4 years later in '77 into passenger service. But it only actually flew 55 scheduled flights, which is perhaps quite surprising, and about the same number of freight trips. And then it was withdrawn because of safety issues, safety concerns, and that was that. And there's a lot more I could talk about that, but we're a bit limited on time for that. But actually, interesting, it wasn't the end of the story for Concordski. And this is a little-known program. In the early 1990s, American businesswoman Judith DePaul had an aerospace company, and she happened to be good friends with Bill Clinton. And between the two of them, they organized the renting of this Concordski from the Russians at a cost of $350 million with refinements to do testing for supersonic flight, because NASA actually believed there would be a second wave of supersonic aircraft, and they had nothing to test it on. So they rented this Concordski from the Russians at a cost of $350, and if you look up there, that's the stars and stripes on the tail. I bet you never knew that. I've not met anybody who actually knew that. It's very, very interesting. So what about us? What about Britain's experience in building supersonic aircraft? Anybody recognize that? Nobody? Fairy Delta, absolutely. Amazing piece of airplane. At the time, the airspeed record was held by the Americans around about 750 miles an hour. On this aircraft's first run, it nearly doubled it up to 1,400 miles an hour. A phenomenal increase. The sad story of this aircraft, in a way, is perhaps a reflection on British industry and our ability to manage such projects. When they were ready to do this test flying, they had arranged to do it in Toulouse at Dassault's airfield, and just before they're about to go, the British Air Ministry rang them up and said, oh, by the way, you do know that you will not be insured by us if you're flying down there. And the problem was, of course, Britain had banned supersonic flight after the John Derry incident in '52 over the UK. So they weren't allowed to test this aircraft over the UK. They weren't allowed to test it over the sea, because over the sea, if it broke up and crashed, there would be no way of finding the debris to find out what had gone wrong. So where on earth do you test an aircraft? So they had to ask the French, can we fly it over France? To which they said yes. However, the British government then said, you're not going to be insured. So the ferry people rang up Dassault and said, look, I'm terribly sorry, we can't come. And they said, why not? And they said, we can't get insured. And they'd gone to the London market and got most astronomical quotes from Lloyd's to do this, way past their ability to pay. And Dassault said, no problem, you put it on our insurance policy. And it cost them £47. I really do think that about sums up the problems we have in organising ourselves in this country. I mean, it's really a bit desperate, isn't it? So after that, of course, there was the English Electric Lightning, and then, of course, the TSR-2 a little bit later on, and that's a very interesting story in itself, whether it was a flyable aircraft. So we did have some good background to it, but nevertheless, it was a heck of a dream that we were putting. In '59, the UK Supersonic Transport Committee reported favourably that this SST transport could be done. And don't forget, this was a time when we had not built a successful jet transport. The Comet was still grounded because of issues there with metal fatigue. We didn't have any real background experience in flying commercially jet, let alone supersonic. So it was a heck of a brave decision to take. But in '54, the Olympus engine was already producing a fair bit of thrust, and more was going to be needed. But then they merged with Bristol Siddeley and started to produce more, 17,000 pounds of thrust. Then the British Airplane Company got together, the British Aircraft Corporation was formed, and eventually they got the go-ahead to do this. And obviously the funding required for this project was enormous. So as it happened, Sud Aviation were doing the same project with their French version. So the Concorde between us and the Brits and the French came about, and they were the obvious choice in partners. And in '62, draft treaty was signed between the governments in terms of they were going to be effectively the brokers, the manufacturers using our businesses, and then a consortium secured orders for over 100 aircraft with Pan Am, BAOC and Air France as the launch customers, with 6 each. And Concorde first took off from Toulouse, 2nd of March '69, followed by the first supersonic flight on the 1st of October. And then I'm sure most of you who are of my age will remember Concorde taking off from Filton, which we might see a bit later on if we've got time, piloted by Brian Trubshaw. So '72 to '74, BA and BAC merged. British Airways came around. They ordered the 5 aircraft, and the purchase was completed between '76 and '77. And the nominal cost was $22.5 million per aircraft, which is cheap today. I mean, a 747 today will cost you $360 million. So BAC merged, and we've seen that one, I beg your pardon. I must have backtracked, I do beg your pardon. So let's have a quick look inside Concorde. This is the flight deck of Concorde. Very small, only 9'6" across in the body. And as you can see, the flight deck here. Mike Bannister, the last chief pilot of Concorde, in there. I don't think I would have got in, even if I'd been in the line for flying Concorde. I think it would have been a bit tight for me. And the back was equally small. Those, I'm sure several people here will have flown in it, was small, no hat locker room at the top. And the 80s, the Concorde was losing a lot of money. Operation, it was losing a lot of money. And they were then siphoned off into a separate division. And it had been seen as a rich man's tool to travel the Atlantic, which to some extent it was, but it then went into the charter business. And again, is there anybody here who did the Cunard and Concorde flight charter together at New York? Yeah. There's usually a few around who did that. Travel one way on the Queen Elizabeth and then fly back with Concorde. $2,000. Good deal. Very good deal. What was the exchange rate at the time? That would have even been better. But the late 80s, believe it or not, 28% of passengers on Concorde were charter passengers, which was quite surprising, really. But there were technical problems with Concorde, not the ones we know. Believe it or not, occasionally the rudder would fall off. And they had to spend about £5 million building spare rudders to be dotted around New York and London. And when I was with EasyJet, I was a training captain with them. The first guy I trained onto command was an ex-Concorde captain. And he told me it was quite regular. He often got to New York, and Graham would say, you know, your rudder's missing. He said, oh, was it top or bottom this time? And it was because they had two rudders. So, yeah, it was an issue, and it cost a lot of money to get it sorted out. And then, of course, there were the tyres. And at Paris, 25th of July 2000. And as you probably know, there was a strip of metal, it's thought, on the runway come off a Continental DC-10, which punctured a tyre, and that caused the tyre to burst, go through the wing tank, and it crashed into a little village called Genoese, killed all the passengers and crew on board, and also 4 people on the ground. The 4 people on the ground, in fact, were staff in a restaurant of a hotel, which were just preparing for 50 British school children musicians to arrive for lunch. And on my previous Cunard lecture, one of the ladies came up to me and said, I was one of those school children that was supposed to be in that hotel, which is, you know, quite spooky, really. So disaster it was, but half an hour later it would have been a much, much bigger and personal disaster for Britain, that's for sure. So the accident resulted in a program of modifications to Concorde, which I'm sure we remember included more secure electrical controls, Kevlar linings for the fuel tanks. We've all seen those films of the guys trying to put those in, and specifically developed burst-resistant tyres, which perhaps was bolting the gate after the horse had gone. And the first BA passengers took off, and these were staff. I was actually working for BA on the Embraer at the time, and I put my name in a hat, but it didn't get pulled out. And it was actually airborne over the Bay of Biscay, actually, when the Twin Towers attacks took place. So there was a bit of irony. After all that, it was during that flight, the test flight, that it happened. And as a result of that attack on the World Trade Center, 40 BA frequent flyers, mainly Concorde passengers, were killed. Largely they were in the towers, not actually in the aircraft themselves. And of course America, businessmen, did not want to fly transatlantic, full stop. I think we all remember the turn down of the businessman's class at those days, and Concorde, of course, was right at the head of that. So in addition to the problems of people not wanting to fly, the modifications that were now going to be required for security reasons, the extra bulletproof doors, etc., around about £10 million was going to be needed for each aircraft to be spent, and that was just simply too much to be done. It would not make that much money in the rest of its lifespan. So Airbus said they would not support after October. I should think they were probably talking to their insurance brokers about liability at the time. And without the backup of Airbus, then you could not operate this aircraft. It would not be legal to do so. With the Air Operator Certificate, you do require an engineering company behind a commercial aircraft. So on the 10th of April, BA and Air France simultaneously said they were going to withdraw, and Air France pulled out in April, and the British Airways flight in October. But suddenly, a saviour appeared. Dear old Richard, couldn't keep him down. He offered to buy the whole fleet for £1, which is what he said British Airways had paid for it. And he was probably not far from right, actually. He actually did increase his offer up to £5 million, apparently. But he said, no, they didn't pay for them, so why should I? But I will fly them. Now, whether it was just a good publicity stunt or what, nobody will ever know, because obviously the offers were refused and the Concords were retired. So Air France made its final commercial flight, to say, in May 2003 and retired to Toulouse. British Airways was in October of that year from JFK to Heathrow. And here's the footage of the very last takeoff of Concorde from Heathrow. Site that was. So where are they now? Well, these are the British Airways aircraft, where they are. There's one at Grantley Adams Airport in Barbados, which I'm glad to say is now undercover. First time I saw it, it was out in the pouring rain. And the same at Manchester, that's now encased, thankfully. So this is where the British Airways aircraft ended up. The test aircraft, there's one down, is it Filton or Brooklands? I can't remember which one it is. Brooklands, right. Being at Coventry Airport, I wish they'd brought one to Coventry Airport, because we've got the Midlands Air Museum just down from us, and I thought that would have been great. Nice place to have it right in the middle of the country, but there we are. So, who might be next? Who might build a supersonic transport next? Well, the Japanese are looking at it at the moment, and they've come up with some designs. This is their artist's impression of an aircraft they're looking to build, and the secret of this is what, incidentally, a model they put on a rocket to test the aerodynamics of the aircraft skin. And their secret is the engine. It's actually what's called a turbofan type engine, because of this large fan at the front, but yet it can operate at supersonic speeds. Nobody knows quite how that's going to work and whether it will work. But hey, if anybody can do it, it's quite likely to be the Japanese, that's for sure. This is a British design. This is the Sonic Star. This is designed to carry 20 people from London to Sydney in 5 hours. They haven't said what the cost of the ticket is. I would doubt there's anybody in this room who will be flying on this aircraft, but there might be, it might be. I certainly shan't, that's for dead sure. It will be very, very expensive. And interesting enough, this is a design from a company in Oxfordshire, REL, Reaction Engines Limited. They've actually designed the engine, this thing here. It's called the Sabre engine. And this is their design of an aircraft, theoretically, that could utilize the Sabre engine. And its unique footprint, if you like, is that it can use conventional fuel at normal low-level altitudes taking off. It's a non-moving part jet engine. There are no rotor blades, there's no stator blades, and it will switch over to jet fuel once it's up in the higher altitudes. But it is being designed at this stage, or perceived at this stage, as a space delivery vehicle, not a passenger carrying vehicle. So who knows, the thought processes are there. This is sort of American stuff. This is hypersonic aircraft they're testing, undoubtedly for military, obviously, purposes, but who knows where it might eventually go. This, interesting enough, is a design from a guy called Adolf Bussmann, a German scientist who actually put a paper about supersonic flight in 1935 to an aviation conference in Yalta, but at the time there was no technology to support supersonic flight, so it was regarded as a bit of an academic piece. But this is a design he came up with in the 40s for a biplane, the 50s, of a biplane, a supersonic biplane, which has no noise footprint. And NASA apparently are working on that just to see whether that is a feasible option or not. And then, of course, you can't keep dear old Richard down. His battleship Galactica, as I call it, Virgin Galactica, and they're building an airfield at Curacao in the West Indies for this to take off. This is a piggyback aircraft, which will sit on the back of a larger delivery aircraft, which will fly to high altitude, and then this cabin containing the passengers and guests will use its own jet engine to go up even higher and then effectively glide down to Earth. So if you've got $200,000 to spare and $20,000 to put down as a deposit now, you can book your place on that online without any problem at all. So will it happen again? There's a big question often asked. Probably. but the same big issues will occur once again. Upper atmosphere pollution, a sonic boom, there's a lot of development work to reduce that, and development and operating costs against revenue. How much can you charge passengers for flying in this machine, which is going to cost you an awful lot? Well, who will build it? Well, for my money, I think if anybody can do it or would do it, you need three things. You need the money, you need the desire, and you need the political control over your people who won't object to you blasting their ears out every so often. There's only one nation in the world that can do that at the moment, and that's the Chinese. They have the money, they have the political control, and they definitely have the desire to show that they're ahead. They're the only nation that can put regularly astronauts in space at the moment. So it's possible, it's feasible. But anyway, for now, a little bit of nostalgia. I think I've got this video on here. If you want to get your handkerchiefs out.
There at the end of the runway is Concorde 001 and Ingeloos that's joined Raymond Baxter.
Just seconds to go.
Et maintenant, enfin, le premier vol.
110 tons of aircraft, all up weight there. The magic moment with us. The crescendo of sound from the 593 Olympics.
Ce premier vol que vous tous allez voir maintenant en direct.
45 knots, 90, 135. Nose come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne. She flies.
The Concorde was special. The quality of the work, the minds, the skill, the talent, the commitment that went into it, that's what really matters.
Over the last 27 years, Concorde has captured the imagination of people from all over the world. An extraordinary feat of engineering, a unique blend of power, grace, and beauty.
First time I've ever been in the air. Never dreamt of going in because I'm retired.
I am thrilled. Every single cell in my body is thrilled.
Words fail me. It's so incredible. It's a wonderful experience.
What are you going to tell your school friends when you get back to school on Monday?
Well, trying to find a way of getting them to believe me.
Good morning, sir.
Morning. Welcome aboard.
Welcome to Concorde and our supersonic operation from London's Heathrow to New York's John F. Kennedy. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We're through Mark 1, the speed of sound, no bumps, no bangs. Concorde.
There's the view of New York from the Triborough Bridge, there's the Sydney Opera House, and there's Concorde, arguably the three most beautiful man-made sights in the world.
Carried the Queen Mother, world leaders, stars. It has been an amazing magnet.
For 27 years, British Airways Concorde has been a national symbol, a natural centerpiece for celebration.
A few hundred feet over the heads of 1 million people, maybe more, Concorde and the Red Arrows fill the sky.
We flew down the Mall and you could see Her Majesty standing on the balcony. I've never seen 1 million people before, let alone them all looking up and waving and cheering for Concorde.
She's brought cities together, brought people closer, and reminded us all that we can do extraordinary things.
You kind of think, oh, I wonder who might be on Concorde, maybe a famous film star who's just signed a contract in New York or something.
Catherine Zeta-Jones is an absolute star, so glamorous, so Hollywood. Paul McCartney is probably everyone's favourite. He will say hello and he remembers us. Oh, Richard Gere. I've loved him since I was about 5.
You can always recognise it, and it looks like a swan. You know, when swans fly, it looks like a swan with the shape of its neck.
It's the most brilliant example of far-sighted designers, thought ahead and kept to lead for half a century.
No matter how many times you fly, there still is that amazing, exciting sensation when you take off.
Every day is a thrill. By the time the passengers come on board, the air is absolutely charged with excitement.
Speedboat Concorde 1, you're clear for takeoff. 27 left, surface wind, 240 at 10.
Speedboat Concorde 1, roger, clear for takeoff, 27 left.
It's a thrill. It's the nearest thing I'll ever feel to a rocket.
Power starts to bite, push back into your seat.
Gear speed's building.
You're concentrating like mad.
60 knots.
The noise takes over.
100 knots. That's it.
Heart starts to pound a bit.
B1. Rotate. B2. Positive climb.
For 27 years, she has been our flagship, and her inspiration will stay with us as we take our standards of service still higher and higher.
There we are. Have you got a handkerchief out? I get prickles on the back of my neck every time I see that. So that's the end of the first lecture, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's plenty of time if you want to do question and answers, but I see a lot of people obviously escaping for lunch, quite understandably. We can do it here, or you can come down and have a chat. I don't mind, as you like, if you want to do some Q&As. The next lecture is just after we leave Tenerife, and I think that one is how on earth does it fly? And we talk about aerodynamics and how aircraft get airborne, which is quite interesting, I think. Hope you will do as well. There are some leaflets at the back, by the way, because I actually run a simulator facility at Coventry Airport these days. We have a Boeing 737 and a 747 and a recently arrived Airbus. You can come and fly a 747. We'll show you how to do it. So if you want to pick up one of those leaflets, it'll tell you a bit about that, and perhaps I'll see you in Coventry. So I think for question and answers, perhaps, do you want to sit here and do them, or do you want to pop down the front, or do you want to go? I really don't mind. Has anybody got a question? We'll start that way. Has anybody got a question?